Hi, hello, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Maddie, and for today's video, I'm going to be doing my January monthly wrap-up of all the books that I read in the month of January. And look at me actually using my reading journal to capture my thoughts about my January reads. And for some quick stats for my month, in January I read 8 books. 2 out of the 8 were physical books, and the rest of them were digital books on my Kindle. Also, 5 of the books that I read this month I borrowed from my library. Your friendly reminder to use your local library if you have access to one. It is a great resource to read books that you want to read. I started off January with a novella. It's How the King of Elfheim Learned to Hate Stories. This is part of the Cruel Prince trilogy universe. This novella covers the pre and during events of the Cruel Prince, and it is from Carden's perspective, so you gain more insight onto his character and why he was the way he was in the Cruel Prince. Also, it just has such beautiful illustrations all throughout the novel, and I think the paperback is really well constructed and it just feels very sturdy. The pages feel sturdy. I really love the construction of the book along with the story. And I believe this is under 300 pages, so I ended up reading this book or this novella in one sitting. Also, it's mostly pictures, so there's not a lot of words on every page. I ended up rating this 4 stars. I thought it was a great little story in the Cruel Prince trilogy universe. I loved reading from Carden's perspective. And I don't know, you just got some little more tidbits in that universe and of Jude and Carden and other characters as well, so I really enjoyed it. Then I read Us in Ruins. I borrowed the digital book from my library. This is a young adult fantasy book, but I feel like it's more magical realism than fantasy itself. This is described as a standalone rom-com adventure, and I feel like that description fits the book. And also, I really appreciated that it is a standalone because I feel like there's just so many series out in the world these days, and sometimes I just want a book that I can finish and kind of just be done with that storyline and appreciate it for what it was at that time of reading. I do love series, don't get me wrong, but I also appreciate my standalones. This book follows Margot. She's on a school trip in Italy, but she's actually there on her own personal quest to reassemble a broken vase with the help of a boy turned statue turned back into boy from the 1930s. I ended up rating this book 3 stars. A part of me thought it was cute and entertaining. Another part of me thought that the MMC van, I don't know, he was like a little bit too mean in the beginning for my personal liking, and I felt that Margot, the FMC, would get really hurt by the things that he was saying to her. And I don't know, I just did not feel the connection or the love there. So when their relationship actually did turn into love, I was not that invested in their relationship. Also, I know this is a young adult book, but I felt like you have to suspend your disbeliefs a lot for this book. The whole school trip and all the things that Margot got away with as a high school student was very illogical and would never happen on a school-funded high school trip in another country. Like, yes, everyone wants to have their Lizzie McGuire moment, but we all know that's not real. I know I'm saying this about a magical realism book where a boy turns into a statue and turns back into a boy again, but just the small details around the logistics of the school trip were kind of bothering me. Yeah, I thought it was cute. I thought it was entertaining. I wish it could have been better in my opinion, but I still enjoyed it, and I would recommend it to other people because I feel like the premise of it is just so unique and fun. So I'm sure there's people out there who will enjoy the book better or more than I did. Next, I read Jane and Edward. I also borrowed this from my library, the digital version, to read on my Kindle. This is a modern reimagining of Jane Eyre, and if you know me, you know that I love Jane Eyre and essentially the entire franchise. I've read the book, I've seen most of the film and TV show adaptations. I just really love the story and the characters and the drama and the yearning. It just gets me every time. So, Jane and Edward is a modern reimagining of that tale, and it's actually my first reimagining of Jane Eyre that I have ever read. And it's essentially a workplace romance set in modern day Toronto at a law firm. And of course, this book has the classic Jane and Edward characters. I felt like the reimagined characters of Jane and Edward still felt true to the original Jane and Edward characters, but obviously were modernized and were a little bit different, but I still appreciated them and enjoyed the creative liberties that the story took in order to modernize Jane Eyre. So, yeah, I love Jane, I love Edward, I love the characters, I love the plot, I love the romance. It definitely had my heart hurting at some times, and I feel like there was a good amount of yearning between both of them throughout most of the story, which I really loved personally. And I felt that the reimagining worked for the most part in a modern sense. There were times in the book that I thought that the reimagining or the modernization of the story didn't exactly work, but I get that in order for the book to be a reimagining, they had to include some of the big plot points of Jane Eyre. And because that book was written so long ago, in completely different circumstances in a completely different time period, I feel like it is hard to 100% translate it in a modern way that fully makes sense and fully fits in the modern world. But I thought the author did a really good job at doing so. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it. I rated it 4.25 stars. And honestly, I might get a physical copy of this book because I would love to reread it one day. Then I read This Woven Kingdom. This book is part of a young adult trilogy, a romantasy trilogy, and I really enjoyed this book. It has clashing empires, a forbidden romance, a long forgotten queen. It's based on Persian mythology, which I found to be really insightful into Persian mythology because I haven't read books that were based on Persian mythology before, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I will say This Woven Kingdom is a slower paced book, and I don't mean that as a negative thing. One of my pet peeves is when slower paced books are considered to be bad books because they are slower paced, which I don't consider slower pace as a negative thing. I felt that the slower pace of This Woven Kingdom really fit the setting and the characters of the story. The world was very descriptive and immersive, and there's a lot of political dynamics at play that are interesting to read about. And this book is very romantic, so I also enjoyed that as well. One thing that tripped me up about this book is that the entire plot is set over the course of a couple of days, and sometimes I would forget that fact, and I'm like, oh wait, it's only been like 2 days. And this book does have a crazy ending, and I really, really liked it. So I'm excited to read the next book. I'm just waiting to be able to borrow it from my library. So hopefully I get to read it in February, if not March. Then I read Once Persuaded, Twice Shy. This is the same author that wrote Jane and Edward, except this is a persuasion modern reimagining, and it's basically a second chance romance. And I'm not gonna lie, I still haven't read Persuasion by Jane Austen, but I've seen adaptations of Persuasion, which I know is like a sin to watch the adaptations of a book before actually reading the book, but don't hate me, I did it. So I know the general idea and the general characters of Persuasion, so I wasn't going into this book completely blind. This book is set in modern day Canada in a small town that is filled with zany side characters, such as a Canadian goose that is a menace, and I really like that character. And because it is a second chance romance, I felt like there was just a ton of yearning, and I don't know, the romance just had my heart hurting a little bit at times. So I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4.25 stars as well. And I can't wait to read more in this series if the author ends up putting out more books in this series, because I have really enjoyed all of them so far. When I read Fourth Wing, this is very popular. I actually have an entire dedicated video of my reading vlog and review on Fourth Wing. But for whatever reason, if you didn't know, Fourth Wing is part of a romantasy series. I think it's going to be like 5 books or something, but don't quote me on that. Essentially, it's enemies to lovers, it has dragons, it has war, it has a war college, and yeah, that's about it. The first book follows Violet as she enters this war college, which is kind of a bad idea, but her war general mother forces her to do so, even though Violet has been training to be a scribe for her entire life up until that point. Anyways, Violet joins and trains in this war college, and of course, there is another boy there named Zayden who is the son of the dead rebellion leader, and he hates Violet's mom because she is the general that his dad, so therefore he hates Violet as well. But of course, hate turns into love for them. Also, there's this like looming war in the background that like doesn't make sense for 90% of the book and is there and never explained until the very end, so just fair warning. But like I said, this book has a ton of tropes that people love. I personally really love the dragons. I thought they were really cool. I also love Zayden. I thought he brought the drama, so he was entertaining, but that is about it. I found the world building and the plot to be lacking or not really make sense, but I will say, obviously, this is the first book in this series. There's other books in the series, and there's going to be more books in the series. As of right now, only Iron Flame and Onyx Storm are released, so perhaps more things get explained, or perhaps they will never be explained. Anyways, as a result, I rated Fourth Wing 3 stars. I thought it was a fun romantasy book, but I wish it could have been better in terms of the world building and the plot, personally. Then I reread Divine Rivals, and I loved Divine Rivals so much more upon reread. This is a YA fantasy magical realism duology. It's also historic. It follows the main character Iris, and her brother goes missing at the front lines of a god war, and her mother is drowning in sorrow. As a result, she writes letters that end up falling in the hands of Roman, who is her workplace rival at the Oath Gazette. And as a result, they form an unlikely connection, and the threat of the war threatens to tear them apart. But you could already tell that this deals with rivals who turn into lovers, there's magical typewriters, and also just the world itself just feels very magical and whimsical, and it's very atmospheric, and it's so romantic. There's so much yearning and just so many lingering glimpses between Iris and Roman that I loved so much. It's very romantic, very beautiful writing. I think when I first read Divine Rivals, I rated it 4 stars because I wished that the gods were explained more, but upon reread, that didn't really bother me anymore, and I truly appreciated the characters and the writing as it was in the book, so I ended up bumping up my rating to 5 stars, and I have no regrets doing so. I truly love this book. It was very good. To end the month, I read The Reappearance of Rachel Price. I also borrowed this from my library. This is a YA mystery thriller. It follows the main character Belle, and Belle's mother, Rachel Price, mysteriously disappeared when Belle was like a toddler, and the only witness was Belle herself, but obviously she was so young that she doesn't remember. So years and years later, I think Belle is like 18 or 19, her family does a true crime documentary on the disappearance of Rachel Price. During the middle of filming the documentary, Rachel Price reappears, and basically everything just changes from that moment on. I ended up rating this 3.5 stars. A part of me really loved the documentary setting. I thought that was so unique and just a unique way to tell the details of Rachel Price's disappearance and also the dynamic between Belle and her family members as well. And I was really entertained by the majority of this book, and I read it in one day for a video where I swapped my screen time for reading time. But I felt like the documentary setting was like thrown out the window halfway through the book, and then it was kind of forgotten about until the end of the book where it was relevant again. And also at the very end, the final like climax, I just I just didn't think it was that believable. Just the very, very end of the book. I don't know. I know this is like a YA book and it's also a YA mystery thriller, so I tend to suspend my disbeliefs for that genre specifically. Like, I love the Natural series, which is literally teenage criminal minds. Like, that is very unrealistic, but it was so much fun and I love the characters. However, for the reappearance of Rachel Price, I felt like the ending was just like too unrealistic for me. I don't know, something about it just like didn't completely work. And I wasn't like that connected to the characters or like the weird subplot of romance that wasn't really romance. So I ended up rating it 3.5 stars. Like I said, I thought it was fun and entertaining, and I liked the mystery component of it, but it wasn't my personal favorite. That is every book that I read in January. Let me know what you read in January. I would love to know. Hopefully you made it this far and hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.